Mr. Cooper, greetings. Great to see you in First Western. Thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure. Glad to be here, Daniel.
I would like to start with President Biden's address to the nation. He covered the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel. In your opinion, has this address achieved its initial goal?
Well, we'll start with that it was important that the President of the United States, actually any President of the United States, speak directly to the American people as to what is important from a standpoint of U.S. interest, particularly when one's talking about taxpayer resources being applied toward assistance. And of course, the address that we're talking about, President Biden was specifically explaining to the American population why it's important U.S. tax dollars are spent to provide not only humanitarian assistance, but also security cooperation or security assistance to two very important states, two states that are critical to U.S. interests. And so when we're talking about that total package of $105 billion that President Biden mentioned, it has national security imperatives, but there's also a humanitarian component as well.
Let's cover also diplomatic activity in the Middle East. Recently, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and the U.S. President Joe Biden have visited Israel. In your opinion, what are they working on?
Well, first, let's start with optics. Okay, so having the president, having two cabinet ministers, actually the two most senior cabinet ministers, rather the most senior cabinet minister is the Secretary of State in the United States, and second to that is the defense minister, the defense secretary. Having all of them come to Israel did several things. Immediately, it did send a message to Israel and to the Israeli state and the Israeli people that the United States stands stalwart, and a term that's often used across every administration is the ironclad bilateral relationship between the United States and Israel. That was very clear by those visits. And of course, the visits are a reaffirmation for American citizens to know that we support the sovereignty of the state of Israel. The United States, since the beginning, has supported Israel's statehood. And it marked its 75th anniversary early this year in 2023. And so having leadership from Washington to go to Jerusalem and go to Tel Aviv was certainly providing the right message at a very critical time. And also to make it clear, on a much bigger scale regionally, is that we will combat terrorism in any form that they may be. So providing support, is not only just in the frame of security assistance, which the U.S. historically has done, and Israel, of course, is a large recipient of FMF. That's foreign military financing. In fact, it's the largest recipient of FMF. And so those visits, what I would say would be considered a plus up and an affirmation.
Also, President Biden has numerous conversations with both leaders of Israel, leaders of Palestine, and other leaders from the Middle East. In your opinion, how could you assess current President Biden's policy towards the war in Israel?
Well, remember, as I said, Israel is a sovereign state. And as a fellow sovereign state and a state that supports liberal democracy, and this is relevant to Ukraine's fight to maintain its sovereignty. It's important for sovereign states to do just that, recognize the sovereignty of a fellow member state of the United Nations, which Israel is. And that is a U.S. policy. Now, when it comes to that, it's also critical that states, not only in the UN, but most recently, Abraham Accord states. So during the Trump administration, the Abraham Accords validated or further affirmed, I should say further affirmed, because the sovereignty has always been valid, further affirmed sovereignty and bilateral reciprocities amongst a number of Arab states, those being the Kingdom of Morocco, the Kingdom of Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. And those states, also being members of the Arab League, and for example, were very critical in support for Israel's security and sovereignty. Outside of that, when one looks at, from a U.S. perspective, the Central Command Area of Responsibility, or AOR, there's a regional context here. And so any kind of I would say disruptive activity, the terrorist acts of Hamas, not only in Israel, but also the potential further Iranian proxy-driven terrorist acts, not only of Hamas, but Hezbollah, could have disabling effects on the entire region. So there's a unifying effect in the Middle East and a unifying concern about Iran and what Tehran and the regime there are doing to disrupt the region. It's a shared concern. It's not just one that Israel worries about, and it's not just one the United States worries about. Arab states are also concerned.
President Biden supports military efforts of Israel while trying to reduce civilian casualties. In your opinion, would it be a difficult task for Biden administration to also reduce civilian casualties in Gaza?
Well, let's remember, we're talking about states, and there's a state responsibility or an incumbency when it comes to international rules regarding warfare. There are the Geneva Conventions that factor. There are humanitarian aspects and conventions that factor as far as protection of civilians. And then, at a more operational, tactical level, there are rules of engagement. Now, Israel has stated that they're doing just that, but it is critical for the United States and for other states who support and should support Israel's defense and sovereignty to also be there to support the protection of civilians. One of the greatest crimes of Hamas is not only the terror that they inflicted on Israeli citizens, but Hamas has essentially also captured and imprisoned many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And so it's a very difficult time. Israelis have been victims of terrorism, and now Palestinians essentially are victims of Hamas as well. This is certainly not helping any of the processes that would have been at play for the two-state solution.
Also, Bloomberg reports that the US and European governments have been putting pressure on Israel to delay its ground offensive to buy some time for secret negotiations of the release of hostages. In your opinion, could diplomacy work in this case?
Diplomacy always has a role. The challenge is that if one is defending the integrity of their borders, and if one is having to defend the integrity of their sovereignty, which is what Israel is doing, it is their right to defend their state, then they're going to be very limited on what tools are available. Again, that said, there can be parallel tracks. Diplomacy can occur, and it does not preclude a defensive posture or defensive acts. But if one's looking at it from the Israeli perspective, they have limited time for diplomatic tracks to work out. Some of those could be overt tracks, or like track one communications. Some could be a track two, or more of a sub rosa. There are a number of states that could play roles in this. We already mentioned the Arab League. There are states in the Gulf Cooperation Council that could play a role in this, because there are hostages that were captured by Hamas even before the recent terrorist attacks committed. So, yes, both can happen, but we all need to remember that even with diplomatic approaches, at the end of the day, Israel has a right to defend itself.
How could you also assess current humanitarian situation in Gaza, and how could be it affected by possible Israeli ground offensive operation?
So this goes back to rules of engagement, rules of war. It's not the first time we've seen risk to humanitarian aid and assistance. This is happening right now in Europe, in Ukraine. We've seen where humanitarian aid workers are put at risk. We've seen it in recent years in Syria, where white helmets, where humanitarian assistance was put at risk. It is always a risky proposition, and it's also why it's critical that the actors involved are aware. This involves, again, at an operational and a technical level or tactical level, a really tight, close communication. When you're talking about blue force or green force tracking, knowing the difference between humanitarian actors versus the enemy.
Former CIA Director General David Petraeus says that it's crucial to develop a strategy in case of the Gaza invasion. In your opinion, how should such strategy look like?
So, regional context. Mentioned earlier that there are states that have an interest in this. If you're on the side of the terrorist activity of Hamas, Iran is certainly looking very closely as to the efficacy and the capacity that the state of Israel has in their defenses and the will of the people. Neighbors are certainly concerned about this. If one is sitting in Cairo, again, an early state in recognizing Israel's sovereignty, and one where there are bilateral reciprocities, Egypt is certainly concerned about any spillover, either from a migration standpoint or a terrorist risk standpoint. They are most likely to be impacted by anything that could spill over. Also, in other neighboring states, and as I already mentioned, there are Abraham Accord states that are worried about whatever risks might be posed to them. The whole idea of a broader strategy has to be inclusive of the considerations and the capabilities of not only neighboring states in the Middle East and near Israel, but again, the broader, I would say, aspects of Arab League and Gulf cooperation states. For the United States, we're looking at this more as a regional aspect, and it's certainly something that needs to be looked at to avoid a broader, more disruptive space than it already is.
So, U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria have been attacked. In your opinion, what are the risks for the wider conflict in the Middle East?
Well, the risks actually could go even beyond the region. It's important to note publicly, any American that lives or works abroad has received consular notices from the U.S. Department of State regarding safety. So the risk for lone wolf terrorist attacks is something that has actually become a concern in recent days. So this is well outside of the Middle East. This is in places like London, for example, are being monitored closely. So there's not only a conventional military approach to this problem, a diplomacy track to this problem. There's an increasing counterterrorism interest and a counterterrorism approach to this problem.
Also, the U.S. sent additional warships to aircraft carriers closer to Israel, and also recently U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin announced deployment of additional air defense systems to the Middle East. What is the United States preparing for?
Well, wanting to actually, if one looks at it just from an initial approach, these elements of support not only are a visual, tangible element of support, they're also a real aspect of support for our partners and allies. And we have already pre-established agreements and security cooperation with these states. I already mentioned earlier, a shared concern and a shared challenge across these states is the threat emanating directly from Tehran or through proxies of the Iranian regime. And we already know very clearly that Hamas is one of those proxies, and that, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon is another one of those proxies. States other than Israel that have been challenged by Iranian terrorists include Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, etc. So from a U.S. interoperable standpoint, we're wanting to make sure that our partners and allies know that we stand with them, and that we are also seeking to return peace and stability to the region.
Also, China deploys additional 6 warships closer to Israel. There have been such news reports. In your opinion, what a kind of a role China could play in this process in the Middle East?
China is serious about making sure that there is stability, then that's a role they could play. They are a member state of the UN. It is fair to say one could be concerned about what their interests are. We've seen recently when they've been disruptive in a naval aspect against some Philippine craft in recent days, with a Chinese ship butting up against a Philippine ship. We've also seen where there's been some recent posturing toward Taiwan. We have to be very clear-eyed about what is it that Beijing is seeking to do. Are they seeking to be a cooperative member state and a member of the UN Security Council? Or are they looking for, one has to ask, are they looking for opportunity for disruption? And it would be in their best interest not to be a disruptor.
Let's cover also the war in Ukraine. In your opinion, how does the war in Israel influence the war in Ukraine from your professional point of view?
Well, we've talked about resources, right? So at the top of our conversation, you mentioned the $105 billion in supplemental aid to Israel and Ukraine, inclusive of security assistance and humanitarian assistance. And of course, this is a package along with other forms of aid that require congressional review and approval. And understandably, Congress expects the executive branch, again, doesn't matter if it's President Biden, President Trump, President Obama, or President Bush, every Congress has expected accountability from the executive branch when it comes to foreign assistance. And accountability and transparency are incumbent upon the executive branch. So where the similarities are is Congress is certainly going to be looking at how that aid is broken down, how much of it's going for certain capacity building, how much of it is going for physical material, how much of it's going to be humanitarian aid. But the message is the same. It is in the U.S. interest. It's in U.S. national security interest to get this assistance to Israel and Ukraine. We certainly want to not only support our partners and allies, we also want to make it clear that we send a message to Moscow as well as Tehran that they need not be disruptive states.
Also, the New York Times reports that both Ukraine and Israel need the same weapons for the fight on the ground. For example, Stinger missiles, artillery shells, and smart bombs. Could the US really supply both Ukraine and Israel, even with the similar types of weapons?
Well, this is an interesting point. So a number of current and former officials have really encouraged the current government in Washington to move forward with making clear to the DIB, and that's the Defense Industrial Base in the United States, the need to increase production. Historically, at least in non-wartime, the U.S. Defense Industrial Base is only produced based on need or requirement. This just means that arms are produced or material is produced based on order or based on purchase. It's not like something like there's not extra sitting on a shelf. One can go into a shoe store, there's shelves and shelves of shoes that have been made on speculation that someone may buy them. Arms and material are not produced that way. Arms and material for military purposes are produced based on requirement. It's important that the current posture in Ukraine and Israel highlight the need for the U.S. government to encourage America's defense industry to start producing at a higher rate.
Would it be beneficial for American producers of weapons to increase their rates?
It would be beneficial on twofold. One, it would increase availability not only for U.S. purposes and applications, it would also increase it for partners and allies. And when we just mentioned Ukraine and Israel, but there's others. Taiwan, for example, would fall in that category. And again, the second, not only for our partners, allies, but it's material that the U.S. military needs to use. So it's twofold, right? You could see that there's a parallel there of increased production for U.S. needs, but also make sure that production's increased for either the purchase by a partner or in some cases a direct form of assistance. But yes, I mean there's certainly an argument to strengthen America's defenses whilst also making sure there's enough material for partners and allies.
Russian President Putin recently invited Biden to visit Moscow for pancakes and tea. What do you think about this unusual statement for Russian President Putin?
Well, it's interesting in that one looks at President Putin's posture. If you look at the sanctions that have been applied, and they're quite deep, not only from the United States, but sanctions that have come from other states as well as multilateral bodies, including the European Union. President Putin is certainly seeing where his limitations are right now. He certainly miscalculated or underassessed the strength and will of the Ukrainian people. And also, we just were talking about defense material and weapons. Russia barely has enough to maintain their own sovereignty, let alone continue to combat Ukrainian forces. Russia used to have a number of export markets that they would sell things like MiG jets to, or Kalashnikovs and Kalashnikov bullets for. The problem is they're challenged on being able to meet their exports requirements as they meet their own requirements. So, one could assess or guess that President Putin's invitation might be coming out of a form of desperation. It also might be an attempt by Moscow to try to create another distraction. But it is an interesting time for President Putin to extend such an invitation. Maybe he feels sorry that he was not allowed to be present at the G20. Who knows?
Don't you think that this latest statement from President Putin just reveals that he can no longer escalate and rise stakes?
That's exactly it. As I said, it's a likely example of Putin's desperation. I would imagine that if one of us was in his position, he's got to be acutely aware that people close to him have become quite tired, if not frustrated, with Russia's diminishing status in the world, its diminishing status in the private sector as well as in multilateral bodies, and have become weary about the war in Ukraine. I'm surprised we haven't seen more happen publicly as people realize that a number of their sons and cousins and neighbors are not returning from Ukraine because they've died there and at the hand of Putin.
And my last question for you, In your opinion, could Putin's desperation lead to the end of the war in Ukraine, to withdrawal of his troops from our land?
Possibly, right? But this goes back to remaining strong and steadfast. It's fair enough when President Zelensky and other Western leaders express concern about talks that might equate cost to Ukraine's sovereignty and territory. I think, again, looking at where Moscow may be today, they really are not in a bargaining position. Things become much more difficult for the Russians. And if anything, if they are seeking peace and reconciliation, it means full withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine.
We hope so. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine. Thank you, Daniel.